The largest artificial harbor of the ancient world was not built by Rome. This is the hidden history of the artificial harbors, where entire civilizations reshaped their coastlines to command the sea. You will discover how these forgotten megastructures became the secret engines of the first global economy, linking continents and forging empires. How did engineers 2,000 years ago build ports where nature provided none? And what colossal risks did they take to secure their place in the world? The answer lies in sunken ruins and monsoon-swept shores, where human ambition met the raw power of the ocean. What does it truly mean to defy geography? A ship's captain in that moment faced a brutal choice. Run for the open sea and risk being swamped by towering waves, or try to anchor close to a lee shore and risk being dashed against the rocks. Neither option promised survival for the crew or their precious cargo. This was the daily gamble of ancient trade, a lottery where geography held all the winning tickets. True natural harbors, those by headlands, were astonishingly rare. For every perfect cove like Carthage or Piraeus, there were thousands of miles of coastline that were utterly hostile to shipping, shallow and exposed, or choked with silt from distant rivers. This scarcity created immense power. Whoever controlled a natural harbor controlled a choke point on the world's trade routes, able to levy taxes, deny passage, and grow wealthy from the constant flow of vessels. But what about everyone else? What about the kingdoms and empires whose coastlines offered no such sanctuary, whose ambitions were hemmed in by their own geography? They faced a simple, stark equation. To remain a local power, they could rely on the ports nature gave them. But to become a global power, they would have to build their own. This was the catalyst. The drive for safe, predictable, and controllable points of maritime exchange pushed human ingenuity to its limits. It was no longer enough to find a harbor, you had to invent one. This meant confronting the ocean's raw mechanics on a scale never before attempted, not just building beside the water, but fundamentally restructuring the interface between land and sea. The story of these artificial harbors begins not with a blueprint, but with a desperate need to turn a dangerous, open coast into a haven. It begins with the decision to fight geography itself. To perform that surgery on the coastline, ancient engineers had to become masters of three brutal disciplines. The first was the art of moving mountains, literally. Before a single stone could be laid in the water, they needed an unimaginable quantity of building material. This meant quarrying, not small-scale operations, but industrial-level excavations that the landscape. Teams would carve massive blocks, some weighing tens of tons, from cliffsides and hills miles inland. Then came the Herculean task of transport. Without modern machinery, they relied on ingenuity and sheer human effort. Think of log rollers, of wooden sledges greased with animal fat, pulled by teams of oxen or lines of laborers along carefully prepared causeways. Every single block destined for a breakwater began as a monumental journey overland, a slow, grinding procession from the quiet of the quarry to the roar of the sea. The second discipline was defying the waves themselves. To create calm water, you first have to stand against chaos. The primary weapon was the breakwater, a long, rugged arm of stone thrust out into the surf. But simply piling rocks in the sea was a recipe for disaster. Unbound, a wave would simply scatter them. The solution was precision engineering. The largest, most carefully shaped blocks formed the outer shell, interlocked like a giant, three-dimensional puzzle. The core was then filled with rubble and smaller stones, creating a dense, monolithic structure. The goal was not to be a solid wall, which the sea would eventually pound to dust, but to be a permeable barrier. A well-designed breakwater would absorb and dissipate a wave's energy, letting water filter through its gaps while robbing it of its destructive force. It was a dance with physics, building something strong enough to hold, yet flexible enough to survive. The third and most delicate discipline was controlling what they could not see, the itself. Natural bays are deep. Engineered harbors had to be made deep. This required dredging, the process of excavating mud, sand, and rock from the bottom of a basin to create a navigable channel and safe anchorage. In the ancient world, this was perhaps the most grueling work of all. Divers might descend to loosen material, while teams above used buckets, baskets, and primitive draglines to haul it to the surface, one heavy load at a time. It was a constant battle against siltation, as rivers and currents continually tried to refill the space humans had carved out. Maintaining the depth of an artificial harbor was a perpetual, generations-long commitment. Together, these three disciplines, quarrying, wave-breaking, and dredging, formed the trinity of harbor engineering. Mastering them meant a civilization could write its own ticket to the sea, no longer waiting for nature's permission, but taking its destiny into its own hands. The true cost, however, was measured in more than just stone and labor. The scale of that ambition is almost impossible to grasp from our modern perspective. We must look back to a time when the very idea of building a harbor was not an engineering challenge, but a revelation. The earliest known attempts are like faded fingerprints on the shore, subtle modifications that signaled a profound shift in thinking. Long before empires dreamed of concrete breakwaters, communities were learning to cooperate with the coastline. In the sun-drenched islands of the Bronze Age Aegean, the Minoan civilization, a true sea power, likely began this process. They did not build harbors from nothing, but they mastered the art of enhancement. They would identify a promising natural cove, a slight indentation in the rock, and then improve it. This might mean clearing obstructions from the by hand, building simple wooden jetties to extend the protected area, or carving steps into the rock to make loading and unloading easier. It was a dialogue with the landscape, a way of asking the sea for just a little more space, a little more safety. Far to the south, along the sands of Egypt, a different kind of waterway manipulation was taking shape. Pharaohs of the Old Kingdom envisioned connections beyond the Nile. While not harbors in the open sea sense, their early canal projects aimed to link the Great River to the Red Sea, creating managed corridors for trade vessels. This was harbor thinking applied to rivers, the same desire to control and direct the flow of maritime traffic. But for the first definitive, unmistakable act of harbor construction, we must travel to the coast of the Levant. Here, at a place called Tel Dor in what is now Israel, Phoenician engineers of the 10th century, before the Common Era, left a clear mark. They built sheltered anchorages using precisely cut stone blocks, known as ashlar, to form piers. These structures reached out from the beach into the water, creating calm pockets of water where ships could tie up, protected from the prevailing winds and waves. It was a simple design, almost elegant in its directness, but it represented a quantum leap. This was no longer just improving what nature provided, it was adding something entirely new to the seascape. A human-made feature where before there was only open coast. These early efforts, from the enhanced coves of Crete to the stone piers of Phoenicia, were the first whispers of a much louder conversation. They proved that the relationship between people and the sea did not have to be passive. You could negotiate, you could make adjustments. And if you could build a pier, what was to stop you from building a wall, a breakwater, an entire port city from the bedrock up? The precedent was set, and the race to redesign the world's coastlines had quietly begun. Yet for all their subtle enhancements, a true maritime empire required more than just quiet coves. It demanded ports that could command the weather itself. The Phoenicians, those legendary traders whose ships became synonymous with the deep blue of the Mediterranean, understood this better than anyone. Their homeland was a narrow strip of coast backed by mountains, a place with few generous natural bays. Their greatest cities, like Tyre and Sidon, were often perched on rocky islands or slender promontories, dramatic fortresses in the sea that were notoriously difficult to approach by ship. This geographical constraint became their greatest innovation. To secure their wealth and power, they did not just use the coast, they redesigned it. They became the ancient world's first true architects of the harbor, transforming their precarious island homes into unassailable hubs of global trade. At Tyre, the most famous of their city-states, they performed a staggering feat of engineering. The city sat on an island roughly half a mile offshore. To solve the twin problems of defense and supply, they built a massive causeway, a solid road of stone and earth that connected the island to the mainland. This alone was a monumental task, but it was only the beginning. They then fortified the city with not one, but two artificial harbors, one facing north and the other south. This was of practical design. No matter which way the wind blew, a Phoenician captain could always steer for a protected entrance, slipping into calm water while storms churned the open sea just beyond the harbor walls. The construction techniques were as ingenious as the design. They would sink enormous, carefully shaped stone blocks directly onto to create stable foundations. Upon these underwater platforms, they built quays and docking facilities, essentially extending the solid land out into the water. Their harbors were not just shelters, they were precision instruments for commerce, with warehouses, slipways, and markets all integrated into a seamless, efficient machine. This Phoenician approach was ruthlessly pragmatic. They saw a coastline not as a fixed boundary but as a raw material. If a bay was too small, they expanded it. If an approach was too shallow, they dredged it. If the winds were fickle, they built harbors on two sides. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that the sea was a road, and you could build your own doorstep onto that road, no matter where you lived. In doing so, they proved a revolutionary idea to the entire ancient world. A civilization's reach was no longer limited by the harbors nature provided. You could carve your own gateway to the world, stone by heavy stone, and in controlling that gateway, you could control the flow of empires. It was a lesson written in breakwaters and causeways, a lesson that the next great power of the Mediterranean was watching and learning very closely. But the story of reshaping water for trade was not confined to the stormy Mediterranean coast. Far to the east, in the timeless heat of the Nile Valley, another civilization was approaching the same problem from the opposite direction. The Egyptians were not a seafaring people by nature, their world defined by the predictable, life-giving flow of the river. Yet their ambitions stretched beyond its banks, toward the mineral wealth of the Sinai and the exotic goods arriving by sea from the mysterious land of Punt. To reach them, they faced a daunting barrier of sand and stone, the harsh desert separating the Nile from the Red Sea. Their solution was not to build a harbor on the open ocean, but to erase the distance altogether. They dreamed of a canal. This was not a single project, but a recurring vision pursued by pharaohs for over 1,000 years, from the Middle Kingdom onward. The goal was audacious: to cut a navigable waterway through the desert, linking a branch of the Nile to the Red Sea's Gulf of Suez. Imagine the scale: a man-made river channel dozens of miles long, wide and deep enough for the cargo ships of the age. It was an attempt to stitch two separate worlds of water together, to bring the maritime trade routes directly to the heart of Egypt. While the full canal may not have been permanently maintained, Its repeated attempts reveal a profound understanding of hydraulic engineering and a relentless drive to control geography for economic gain. They were creating an artificial maritime corridor, a safe, managed highway where none existed. Even more mysterious was their work to the west, in the oasis. Here, pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom transformed a natural depression into the vast, managed reservoir known as lake. Through a complex system of canals and dams connected to the Nile, they regulated its water level, turning the surrounding desert into fertile farmland. But some researchers see another layer to this project. The lake was enormous, potentially large and stable enough to support significant boat traffic. Could it have also functioned as a grand inland port, a hub where grain and goods from the newly irrigated fields were gathered and loaded onto vessels for transport north to the Nile and beyond? It is a compelling thought, a bustling harbor in the middle of the desert, serving both agriculture and commerce. These Egyptian endeavors teach us a different but equally powerful principle in the history of artificial harbors. When your geography locks you away from the sea, you do not have to conquer the coast. You can instead re-engineer the interior, bringing the sea to you, or creating entirely new aquatic landscapes to serve your needs. It was harbor thinking applied to a continental scale, proving that the will to control trade routes could manifest not just in breakwaters against the waves, but in canals through the sand and managed lakes under the desert sun. This vision of connection would echo through the centuries, but first, another empire would take the art of the artificial harbor and push it to its absolute, concrete-clad limit. The Greeks looked upon these earlier efforts and saw not just shelter for ships, but a blueprint for empire. For them, a harbor was not merely a refuge. It was a strategic instrument, and its design required the same clarity of thought as a geometric proof. This shift from pragmatic adaptation to systematic planning found its ultimate expression in the port of Piraeus. Under the visionary statesman Themistocles in the 5th century before the Common Era, Athens transformed a cluster of natural rocky bays into a single, unified maritime fortress. This was not a haphazard collection of docks. It was a meticulously zoned machine. 3 distinct harbors were carved out and fortified, each with a dedicated purpose. One served the mighty Athenian navy, its triremes housed in long, covered ship sheds. Another bustled with commercial traffic, the lifeblood of Athenian wealth. A third was reserved for the vital grain trade, securing the city's food supply. Connecting and protecting these basins were long, robust moles, artificial peninsulas of stone that reached into the sea like protective arms. The entire complex was encircled by massive walls, making Piraeus an extension of the city's defenses, an impregnable gateway. This was a revolutionary concept, the harbor as a planned, multifunctional engine of state power. Every stone was placed with intention, every channel dredged for a specific type of vessel. It was geometry applied to geopolitics, proving that the organization of a port could be as decisive in war and peace as the strength of the fleet it housed. This philosophy of the engineered harbor as a tool of civilization reached its breathtaking zenith not in Greece itself, but on the foreign sands of Egypt, born from the conquests of Alexander the Great. His successor, Ptolemy, founded the city of Alexandria on a strip of land between the Mediterranean and a vast lake. The coastline here was a shallow, marshy curve, utterly inadequate for the world capital Alexander had envisioned. So the Hellenistic engineers performed what might be the single most dramatic act of coastal defiance in the ancient world. They built This was a colossal causeway, a mole nearly 1 kilometer long, constructed from countless tons of stone and rubble. It did not just sit in the water, It boldly connected the mainland to the offshore island of Pharos, effectively stitching a new geography into existence. This one monumental structure created two immense, deep-water harbors where before there had only been open, treacherous shore. To the east lay the Great Harbor, a commercial and naval powerhouse. To the west, the Harbor of Happy Return, a safer haven for incoming vessels. There was more than a breakwater, it was a spine, the central artery of a city designed from the ground up to command global trade. By defying the existing coastline so completely, Alexandria did not just find a place on the map, it redrew the map around itself. The city's legendary lighthouse, built on the tip of Pharos, became the symbol of this achievement, a beacon of human ingenuity that literally and metaphorically guided the known world to its new, artificial doorstep. Here, the abstract Greek ideal of the planned harbor met the colossal scale of empire, resulting in a masterpiece that would dominate Mediterranean commerce for centuries. Yet even this staggering feat of engineering would eventually meet its match, not from a rival kingdom, but from a republic that would turn harbor building into an industrial process. Rome took the Greek blueprint and scaled it to the dimensions of a continent. Where earlier civilizations built harbors to secure their cities or their trade, the Romans engineered ports to feed an empire, binding the Mediterranean's distant shores directly to the heart of the capital. Their approach was not one of elegant adaptation, but of overwhelming, systematic conquest. Geography was not a partner to be negotiated with, it was an adversary to be broken by will and mortar. Their ultimate weapon in this fight was not the legion, but a humble-seeming mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and rubble. This was Roman hydraulic concrete, a material that would change the shape of the world's coastlines forever. Unlike any building substance before it, this concrete possessed a miraculous property. When poured into wooden forms directly in the sea, it did not dissolve. It reacted chemically with the curring and hardening into a monolithic, rock-like mass that was actually stronger underwater than in air. This was the magic of opus. It meant Roman engineers could think in 3 dimensions beneath the waves. They could build not just on the coast, but from the itself, constructing foundations and breakwaters in deep, open water where stacking stone blocks would have been impossible. They were no longer limited to the shallow shoreline. They could now command the very frontier where land dropped away into the abyss. This revolutionary material found its most awe-inspiring application not in a foreign province, but at the very doorstep of Rome itself. For centuries, the city relied on the port of Ostia, situated at the mouth of the Tiber River, but Ostia had a fatal flaw. It was a river mouth port, constantly choking on silt carried downstream, its approaches shallow and exposed to the fierce storms of the Tyrrhenian Sea. As Rome grew into a metropolis of over 1 million people, this single, failing gateway became an existential threat. The city's survival depended on grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa. A few storm-wrecked convoys or a silt-blocked harbor could mean famine and riots. The solution was an act of pure imperial audacity. Emperor Claudius decided to bypass nature entirely. Just north of Ostia, on an open, marshy coast with no natural advantages, he ordered the construction of an entirely new harbor from scratch. The scale was staggering. Engineers first dug a massive circular basin out of the coastline, its perimeter lined with concrete piers and warehouses. To protect this new basin from the open sea, they built 2 long, curving concrete breakwaters that reached like arms into the deep water, creating a vast, sheltered anchorage. At the entrance between these arms, they placed a lighthouse on a sunken ship filled with concrete, a beacon to guide the empire's lifeline into safety. But the genius was in its layers. Claudius's basin, however grand, began to suffer the same siltation problems as Ostia. So decades later, Emperor Trajan added a second, interior layer. He excavated a magnificent hexagonal basin further inland, connected to Claudius's harbor by canals. This hexagonal port was a masterpiece of logistics. Its 6 sides provided an immense amount of docking space, and its enclosed, controlled environment allowed for the efficient sorting and storage of cargo before it was loaded onto barges for the short trip up the Tiber to Rome. The entire complex, with its outer storm barrier, its primary receiving basin, and its inner sorting hub, functioned like a perfectly calibrated machine. It was the ancient world's ultimate intermodal shipping container, a single engineered system that defeated silt, tamed storms, and guaranteed that the wealth of the Mediterranean could flow uninterrupted into the capital. Was the ultimate expression of the Roman mindset. It was geography conquered not through acceptance, but through total redesign. Every challenge, from wave action to sediment flow, was met with a relentless, concrete answer. The harbor was not a place they found. It was a place they willed into existence, a monument to the belief that no natural obstacle was insurmountable if it stood in the way of state power. Yet even as the concrete cured in the Italian sun, on the other side of the world, a different ancient superpower was solving the same problems of trade and geography with a philosophy that was, in many ways, the polar opposite. While Rome was mastering concrete, a different kind of harbor genius had already been perfected 4,000 years earlier and 4,000 miles away. In the fertile floodplains of the Indus Valley, a civilization achieved something the Mediterranean world would not replicate for. The city of, in what is now Gujarat, India, was not built on a coast at all. It was situated on the edge of a tidal creek, a shallow, shifting waterway that would have been useless to deep-draft trading vessels. Yet by around 2,400 years before the Common Era, its engineers performed a feat of hydrodynamics so precise it feels almost modern. They built the world's first known tidal dockyard. This was not a sheltered bay they improved or a breakwater they extended. It was a geometric pool of commerce carved into the dry earth, a perfect rectangle of baked brick walls measuring roughly 215 meters by 37 meters. They excavated this massive basin, then connected it to the tidal creek via a carefully engineered channel. But here was the water level in the creek would rise and fall dramatically with the tides. If the dock simply opened to it, ships would be left stranded in the mud at low tide, or risk being dashed against the walls at high tide. So the engineers invented a solution, a lock gate system. A wooden gate, or perhaps a series of them, could be raised or lowered at the entrance to the channel. When the high tide rushed in from the creek, they could open the gates, allowing the basin to fill. Then, as the tide receded, they could close the gates, trapping that deep, calm water inside the brick-walled rectangle. Suddenly, the chaotic rhythm of the ocean was tamed. Ships could enter on the high tide, be locked safely inside a consistent, man-made pool, and load or unload their cargo at any time, completely unaffected by the ebb and flow just a few meters away. This was harbor engineering of a different philosophy. It did not fight the sea with colossal breakwaters, but collaborated with it, using its own hydraulic energy to create a stable, controlled environment. Was more than a dock, it was a machine powered by the moon's gravity, and its purpose was unequivocally global. Artifacts found at the site, including seals and beads, link it directly to the trade networks of ancient Mesopotamia, far across the Arabian Sea. This brick-lined basin was a gateway to another continent. Its existence shatters any notion that artificial harbors were a Mediterranean invention. It stands as a powerful, independent testament to a universal truth. Whenever and wherever a society reached a certain level of complexity and ambition, it faced the same imperative. To engage with the wider world, it had to solve the problem of the harbor. Whether with concrete in Italy or baked brick in India, the drive to rewrite the coastline was a hallmark of civilization itself, a silent, stone and water language spoken by empires that never knew each other's names. A harbor could be built in a generation, but its death sentence was written in every grain of sand. The most formidable enemy these artificial marvels faced was not the storm from without, but the slow, silent invasion from within. Silting was the insidious counterattack of geography, a reminder that nature never truly conceded defeat. Rivers, those lifebloods of civilization, carried a constant payload of eroded soil downstream. Coastal currents swept along endless dunes of seabed sand. Without constant, vigilant intervention, this sediment would settle in the calm waters of a harbor basin, transforming a deep anchorage into a shallow lagoon, and then into useless marshland within a few short decades. The grandest breakwater in the world was meaningless if the space behind it filled with mud. This meant the engineer's work was never truly finished. Their greatest challenge shifted from construction to maintenance, from a single epic project to a perpetual, generations-long campaign. To win this war, they devised strategies of brilliant hydraulic manipulation. The goal was not to stop the sediment, which was impossible, but to outsmart its natural tendency to settle. They learned to make the water work for them. At the Colossal port of, Roman engineers implemented a system of elegant, flowing logic. They constructed separate, dedicated channels for water entering and leaving the vast hexagonal basin. This was not just for boat traffic, it was to engineer a current. By carefully controlling these inflows and outflows, they could create a gentle but constant circulation within the harbor. A slow-motion whirlpool that kept fine particles suspended in the water column long enough to be carried back out to sea before they could sink to the bottom. The harbor was designed to breathe, to flush itself clean with the rhythm of the tides. Other ports employed more direct tactics, the hydraulic equivalent of a controlled explosion. They installed massive sluice gates, essentially giant wooden or metal doors, at strategic points where fresh water from inland rivers or reservoirs could be held back. Engineers would allow water to build up behind these gates, amassing a reservoir of potential energy. Then, at a calculated moment, they would release the pent-up water in a sudden, powerful surge. This torrent would come roaring through the harbor's channels and basins, scouring the accumulated silt from the bottom and blasting it out through the harbor mouth in a great, muddy cloud. It was a periodic reset button for the entire system, a dramatic cleaning powered by gravity and foresight. Perhaps the most sophisticated system of all lies hidden within the ruins of Caesarea, the magnificent harbor built by King Herod the Great on the coast of. Recent archaeological studies suggest its innovative breakwaters, already marvels of Roman concrete engineering, contained a secret within their stone hearts. A network of channels and chambers that functioned like a vast subterranean sewer. The theory proposes that as waves crashed against the outer faces of the breakwaters, water was forced into these internal passages. This circulating flow would have helped prevent silt from settling in the quiet corners behind the structures, essentially using the energy of the attacking sea to keep the harbor's own veins clear. It was a defensive system that turned the enemy's strength against itself. This endless, quiet war against sediment changes how we see these silent stone ruins. We must look past the static monuments and perceive the dynamic, high-maintenance reality they represent. For every year of glorious operation, there were years of relentless dredging, by teams of laborers hauling mud in baskets, of engineers monitoring water levels, of repairs to gates and channels. A successful artificial harbor was not a one-time achievement. It was a sustained act of will, a covenant between a civilization and the sea that required constant renewal. It reveals that the true measure of their ambition was not just in the stones they laid, but in the centuries of labor they were prepared to commit to keep their gateway to the world open. These stone arms reaching into the surf were more than barriers, they were instruments of negotiation. The breakwater was the harbor's defining gambit, a declaration that calm could be carved from chaos. But building a simple wall against the ocean was a fool's errand, a guarantee that the first major storm would scatter the stones like toys. Ancient engineers understood that to win, they could not meet the waves full force head-on, they had to outthink it. Their goal was not to stop the water, but to transform its raw, crashing energy into a harmless trickle. This required designs of surprising sophistication, each a different answer to the same violent question. The earliest and most intuitive form was the rubble mound breakwater. Phoenician builders mastered this art, creating sloping ramparts of unshaped stone, piled high from the. To the untrained eye, it looked like a giant's cairn, a haphazard heap. But its strength lay in its porosity and its shape. As a wave rushed up the sloping face, its energy was spent lifting and moving the individual stones, a fraction of an inch at a time. The water filtered through the gaps, emerging on the other side not as a destructive wall, but as a weakened, foamy surge. It was a brute force solution, but one that leveraged gravity and friction with elegant effectiveness. The Romans, with their revolutionary concrete, pursued a different philosophy altogether, the vertical wall breakwater. Using wooden forms sunk into the deep water, they would pour their liquid stone directly onto the seabed, creating sheer, monolithic cliffs rising from the depths. This was an act of stunning audacity, a claim of permanent territory wrested from the sea. The vertical face reflected wave energy differently, using the water's own power to create turbulence that broke the wave apart. These concrete giants were often hollow, filled with rubble, and capped with massive stone blocks, creating multi-layered fortifications that stood as permanent statements of imperial power. But perhaps the most intriguing hints of ancient hydrodynamic genius come from structures that seem to defy simple categorization. At sites like Caesarea, the arrangement of submerged concrete blocks and the presence of internal channels within the breakwater foundations suggest experiments with a third concept. The perforated or slotted breakwater. The idea is brilliant in its simplicity. By allowing a controlled amount of water to pass through dedicated openings in the structure, engineers could reduce the dangerous backwash caused by waves reflecting off a solid wall. This minimized the churning, turbulent soup just inside the harbor mouth that could capsize ships attempting to enter. It was a way of letting the sea breathe, of managing its energy rather than just battling it. Alongside these dedicated defensive arms stood the mole, a multifunctional masterpiece. More than a breakwater, a mole was a causeway, a pier, and often the very face of the city presented to arriving ships. It was a place of work and ceremony. Imagine a wide, stone-paved road stretching hundreds of feet into the sea, with deep water on one side for mooring merchant vessels, and perhaps a more sheltered basin on the other for naval galleys. Warehouses and customs offices lined its back, cranes swung cargo from ship to shore, and triumphant arches might mark its landward gate, framing the city for those who stepped onto dry land. The mole was both utility and theater, the engineered threshold where the chaotic realm of the ocean officially ended and the ordered world of civilization began. The construction of these maritime fortresses demanded a deep, almost intuitive knowledge of the local sea. Engineers had to become students of the wind, observing seasonal storm patterns. They had to understand the fetch, the distance over which wind builds waves, to predict the height and force of winter swells. Their choice of materials, the angle of a slope, the placement of a foundation block, all were decisions informed by generations of hard-won, often disastrous experience. They were applying principles of material science and fluid dynamics long before those terms existed, writing their textbooks not on parchment, but in the enduring language of stone and surviving storms. The battle for depth was fought not just against the waves, but against the very bottom of the sea. To welcome the heavy, deep-draft ships that carried grain, marble, and spices across the known world, a harbor needed more than calm water, it needed profound water. The natural near shore was often a shallow, sloping plain of sand and mud, utterly inadequate. So engineers embarked on the most grueling task of all, dredging, the systematic excavation of the seabed itself. Imagine the challenge, removing thousands upon thousands of tons of wet, heavy sediment without a single diesel engine or steel bucket in sight. This was archaeology in reverse, not digging to find the past but digging to create the future. The tools were simple, but the scale was staggering. Evidence points to the use of large, heavy-duty drag buckets. Picture a massive iron or wooden scoop, its leading edge often reinforced, attached to long ropes. Teams of laborers on a barge or on the shore would heave on these lines, dragging the bucket across the harbor bottom like a plow through a submerged field. When full, it was hauled to the surface, its load of silt, sand, and shells dumped onto another barge or onto the emerging land. It was a Sisyphean cycle of pull, lift, dump, and return, repeated for months or years, one heavy scoop at a time. For more targeted work, or in areas with a firm bottom, they might employ a different tactic, the coffer dam. This was a temporary wall, built of driven wooden piles sealed with clay, erected to enclose a section of the shoreline or shallow seabed. Once the dam was watertight, workers would use buckets and pumps, often simple hand-operated devices, to bail the enclosed area dry. Suddenly, what was a murky underwater workspace became a muddy but accessible pit. Teams could then descend into it and excavate the basin floor with shovels and baskets, working in the open air as if digging a foundation on land. This method allowed for incredible precision, enabling them to carve the exact depth and slope they needed directly into the earth. But the story of dredging is not just one of removal, it is also a tale of creative reuse. All that excavated material, every bucket of mud and load of sand, was far too valuable to simply discard. It became the literal building blocks of the new port. Engineers would direct this spoil to strategic locations, using it to reclaim land from the water, to build up and extend quays, or to raise the level of warehouse districts above the flood line. At the magnificent Roman port of Magna in North Africa, this process of dredging and land-making transformed the coastline itself. The natural shoreline here was extended seaward through a monumental act of landfill, creating vast new platforms for temples, markets, and docks, where before there had only been sea. The harbor basin they carved in front of this new land was a deep, rectangular masterpiece, allowing the largest grain freighters of the empire to dock directly alongside the city's heart. The scale of this operation at countless other ports speaks to something far beyond engineering prowess. It reveals an immense organizational capacity, a command of labor and logistics that could sustain a years-long, messy, and brutally physical campaign. It was all for a prize measured in mere feet, the critical difference between a ship floating freely and a ship stuck fast in the mud. That extra depth was the margin between a functioning global hub and a forgotten backwater, a margin they were willing to move mountains, or rather, move seabeds to secure. A stone breakwater did more than calm the water, it calmed the market. The true value of these engineered harbors was not measured in the tons of rock they displaced, but in the radical certainty they introduced to a world of chaos. For a merchant in antiquity, risk was the single greatest cost of doing business. Every voyage was a gamble against pirates, storms, and treacherous landfalls. An artificial harbor changed that fundamental equation. It was a guaranteed safe zone, a predictable node in an unpredictable network. Knowing there was a deep, protected basin at the end of a long journey meant a merchant could shift his calculations from survival to scale. He could commission a larger ship, knowing it could be fully loaded and unloaded without grounding. He could plan for a specific return date, allowing him to coordinate with lenders and buyers back home. This reliability was a new form of currency, one that attracted capital and talent from across the known world. Suddenly, the geography of trade was redrawn not by mountains or rivers, but by these man-made gateways. A port like Alexandria, born from the audacious reach, became the ancient world's ultimate trading floor. Its artificial basins created a neutral, secure ground where trade routes converged. In its warehouses, one could find the tangible results of this engineered peace. African ivory was unloaded beside Arabian frankincense. Bales of Indian cotton and sacks of Mediterranean grain were weighed on the same scales. Chinese silk, having traveled overland to the Red Sea, would meet Greek pottery arriving by ship from Athens. Alexandria did not produce most of these goods itself, it processed them. It was a clearinghouse, a place where risk was minimized, values were standardized, and goods from 3 continents could be exchanged, taxed, and sent onward with an efficiency that natural silt-choked anchorages could never match. This catalytic effect rippled out across time and distance. By providing a guaranteed safe haven, these ports effectively lengthened the sailing season. Captains could attempt voyages earlier in the spring and later into the autumn, knowing an engineered refuge awaited them if a sudden gale arose. This expanded the operational window for commerce, making long-distance routes more viable and profitable. More profoundly, it expanded the geographical imagination of traders. A route to a distant shore was no longer a one-way ticket into the unknown if you knew a reliable port lay at both ends. The artificial harbors of the Roman Empire, from to Magna, acted like a chain of secure, taming the entire Mediterranean coastline into a single, manageable circuit. They wove previously disconnected regions, North Africa, Spain, Egypt, Italy, into a tightly knit, interdependent economic web. The grain that fed Rome, the marble that adorned its forums, the spices that flavored its cuisine, all flowed along channels of trade that were, quite literally, carved into the coastline by human hands. The breakwater was the first link in a chain that connected a farmer in Egypt to a baker in Rome, a silent stone arm that reached across the sea to shake hands with a world of commerce. This engineered peace, however, was always defended by warships. The same deep, calm basins that welcomed merchant vessels were perfect for sheltering the instruments of naval power. A fleet without a secure home port was a fleet adrift, vulnerable and limited in its reach. The artificial harbor solved this existential problem for seafaring empires, transforming a logistical necessity into a formidable strategic weapon. It allowed a navy to exist not as a temporary force, but as a permanent, poised extension of the state's will. The Athenian experience at Piraeus made this equation brutally clear. their democracy's golden age, and the security of its vital grain shipments rested entirely on the wooden hulls of its triremes. These sleek warships were fast and lethal, but also fragile, requiring constant maintenance and dry docking. The purpose-built military basins at Piraeus, with their long, covered ship sheds, were not just parking spaces. They were a sophisticated maintenance and readiness system. A trireme could be hauled from the water, its hull cleaned, caulked, and repaired out of the elements, then swiftly relaunched. This meant the Athenian fleet could stay at sea for longer seasons and respond to threats with astonishing speed. Their harbor was the stable, beating heart of their maritime empire, and its loss would mean instant collapse. Perhaps no ancient power understood the military harbor as a secret weapon better than Carthage. Their famous circular harbor, the Chthon, was a masterpiece of paranoid engineering and psychological deterrence. From the outside, it presented a blank, high wall to the main commercial port, giving away nothing. But within that fortified ring lay a hidden, island-centered complex, where hundreds of warships could be concealed and serviced in total secrecy. An enemy fleet approaching Carthage would see a bustling trading port, with no indication of the naval armada resting just out of sight, ready to surge from its hidden mouth. The Chthon was more than a base. It was a trap and a statement, a physical manifestation of Carthaginian control over information and the element of surprise. For the Romans, naval harbors were nodes in a system of control. Ports like on the Bay of Naples and Ravenna on the Adriatic were established not for commerce first, but for dominion. Became the permanent home of the empire's premier battle fleet, the Classis, charged with keeping the peace across the entire central Mediterranean. Ravenna, built within a complex lagoon, offered a naturally defensible and ice-free anchorage for the Adriatic fleet. These were not accidental cities that grew a navy. They were engineered military installations that then attracted civilian settlement. The harbor itself was the reason for the town's existence, its geometry and facilities dictated by the need to quickly marshal, supply, and deploy vessels to any trouble spot. This military function cemented the artificial harbor's role as the ultimate choke point. A narrow, engineered entrance could be sealed with a massive iron chain suspended between towers, physically blocking access. Fortified towers flanking that entrance could rain down projectiles on any unauthorized vessel. High walls encircling the port complex turned it into a coastal fortress, impregnable from the sea. Controlling such a place meant you controlled who entered and left an entire region. You could strangle enemy trade while protecting your own, and you could project power far beyond your shores by ensuring your fleet always had a safe haven to return to. In times of conflict, these harbors became the primary objectives of siege and assault, for capturing one was akin to severing a vital artery. Their very existence made them both shield and target, a paradox built in stone, where the quest for safety inevitably attracted the gaze of those who wished to break it. Yet the true legacy of these stone and concrete giants is not etched in their foundations, but in the human symphony they conducted. An artificial harbor was far more than an economic or military tool. It was a social catalyst of unprecedented power. By design, it created a vortex, pulling in people from every horizon. To build it required armies of laborers, stonecutters, and engineers. To operate it demanded dockworkers, sailmakers, rope merchants, and clerks. To fill its warehouses called for traders, ship captains, and caravan masters. This concentration of need transformed a construction site into a permanent, pulsing urban frontier, one of the most dynamic social experiments of the ancient world. Walk through the ruins of Ostia, the port city that fed Rome. The archaeological record here is not just one of Roman law and Latin script. Inscriptions carved into tombstones and altar stones speak in Greek, Syriac, and Aramaic. They invoke gods from Egypt like Isis and Serapis, or Phoenician deities like Baal. A temple to the Persian sun god Mithras might be tucked into a back street, its underground chamber used for initiation rites by soldiers and merchants alike. The city's very fabric was a mosaic of belief and origin. This was not an accident, it was the direct consequence of the harbor's function. The safe, reliable port became a neutral ground, a crossroads where a sailor from Alexandria, a merchant from Palmyra, and a banker from Carthage could all find a foothold, bringing their customs, their cuisine, and their gods with them. Consider the island of Delos in the Aegean. Declared a free port by Rome in the 2nd century before the Common Era, its modest artificial basins became a frenzy of global exchange. The population exploded with temporary and permanent immigrants. Archaeological excavations have uncovered entire residential districts named for the peoples who lived there, like the Quarter of the Italians or the Syrian Quarter. In these homes, artifacts tell silent stories of blended lives, Egyptian amulets beside Greek drinking cups, and records of business partnerships that crossed ethnic lines. The harbor made Delos a purely commercial entity, a city whose sole reason for existence was connection, and in doing so, it became a preview of a globalized world, centuries before the term existed. This cultural collision was woven into the daily rhythm of the port city. The morning market would smell of North African spices, Sicilian cheese, and Egyptian papyrus. The taverns echoed with a babble of languages, places where news from India might mingle with gossip from Spain over cups of cheap wine. A wealthy merchant might fund a small shrine to his homeland's deity, not as an act of seclusion, but as a public declaration of his identity and success in this new world. The artificial harbor, by guaranteeing safety for ships, had inadvertently guaranteed a kind of safety for people, too, a space where difference was not just tolerated, but was the essential ingredient of prosperity. These cities were microcosms, tiny, engineered worlds where the act of redirecting water and stone had also redirected the flow of human history. They proved that when you build a gateway for trade, you cannot control who or what walks through it. The very forces of engineering and logistics that coastal geography also dissolved social and cultural barriers, creating vibrant, messy, and incredibly modern urban centers. In their crowded streets, the ancient world glimpsed its own future, a future shaped not by isolation, but by the relentless, transformative tide of connection that a safe harbor could unleash. But to understand the sheer audacity of this engineering revolution, we must step onto the sun-bleached shores of a single, spectacular failure. On the coast of Ancient, a king with everything to prove and nothing to lose decided to build a capital from the waves up. Caesarea was King Herod the Great's desperate bid for legacy, a city that would bear the name of his Roman patron, Caesar Augustus. The site he chose was a flat, sandy stretch of coastline utterly devoid of any natural harbor features, a place where the Mediterranean surf crashed unimpeded onto the beach. It was the worst possible location for a port, which was precisely the point. Herod was not looking for a good harbor, he was declaring that he could invent one, and in doing so, invent his own relevance. His engineers, blending Hellenistic design with cutting-edge Roman materials, embarked on what might be the ancient world's most expensive public relations campaign. Their weapon of choice was opus, the same hydraulic concrete that built, but here the challenge was even more extreme. They constructed enormous wooden forms, some as large as houses, loaded them with the liquid stone mixture, and sank them in precise locations onto the open. One by one, these concrete monoliths cured into indestructible underwater mountains. Linked together, they formed the skeleton of two colossal breakwaters, each over 40 meters wide, that reached like grasping arms nearly half a mile out into the deep water. The scale was staggering. These were not mere piers, they were artificial headlands, land masses conjured from chemistry and will. Between them, they enclosed a vast, calm basin of blue water where before there had only been the chaotic, open sea. This manufactured harbor was then dressed for success. At the end of the northern breakwater stood a towering lighthouse, named the after Herod's son, its fire guiding ships safely into the man-made haven. The waterfront was lined with storerooms and ornate colonnades. Beneath the streets, archaeologists have found evidence of a complex sewer system, proof that every aspect of urban life, even waste, was part of the engineered plan. The Jewish historian, writing decades later, still seemed awestruck, claiming its sheltered waters were larger than the famous port of Piraeus. But Caesarea was more than a marvel, it was a message carved in concrete. Every ship that entered its safe embrace passed temples dedicated to Roma and Augustus, seeing Herod's loyalty to Rome literally framed in marble. The harbor was his perfect argument, a functioning, prosperous gateway that tied his unstable kingdom directly into the arteries of Roman trade and imperial favor. For a time, the gamble worked brilliantly. Caesarea flourished, becoming the Roman administrative capital of. Its harbor buzzed with activity, a symbol of what human ambition could achieve against a blank geographical slate. Yet the sea never forgets a challenge. The very concrete breakwaters that the waves may have contained a hidden flaw. Recent studies suggest their innovative, hollow design, which helped dissipate wave energy, might have also made them vulnerable to the relentless seismic activity of the region. Within a century of its completion, sections of the Grand Harbor began to sink, succumbing to slow-motion collapse. The magnificent lighthouse toppled, the deep basin silted up, becoming a swampy marsh. Herod's dream of a permanent, engineered legacy was, in the end, reclaimed by the very elements it was built to conquer. Caesarea stands today not just as a monument to hubris and skill, but as a poignant lesson. It shows that the most advanced technology of its age could create a world in a decade, but the patient forces of geology and hydrology could take it back in a century. The harbor's brilliant rise and slow fall remind us that, in the ancient dialogue between civilization and coast, every victory was temporary, and every stone laid was merely a proposition to the sea. It was not a city, it was a single, colossal machine designed to perform one vital task, feeding Rome. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the metropolis had swollen to over 1 million inhabitants, a population density that would not be seen again in Europe for nearly 2,000 years. Its survival hinged on a fragile lifeline, the annual grain shipments from the fertile fields of Egypt and North Africa. The existing port at the mouth of the Tiber, Ostia, was a bottleneck of disaster. It was a river mouth port, constantly choking on silt, its approaches too shallow for the deep draft grain freighters, and its open roadstead a death trap in the fierce winter storms of the Tyrrhenian Sea. A few sunken ships or a season of bad weather could mean empty granaries, soaring bread prices, and riots in the streets. The very stability of the empire was being held hostage by geography. Emperor Claudius saw this vulnerability and decided to end it, not by improving the old port, but by inventing a new one from nothing. Around 42 years into the Common Era, he ordered the construction of, Latin simply for the port, on a marshy, open coast just north of the Tiber's mouth. This was a declaration of war against logistical chaos. The scale of the initial engineering was breathtaking. workers first excavated a massive circular basin directly from the coastline, creating a vast artificial lagoon. To protect this new anchorage from the open sea, they built two long, curving concrete breakwaters that reached like embracing arms into the deep water. Between the tips of these arms, they created a narrow, defensible entrance. And at the center of this entrance, they deliberately sank an enormous, obsolete grain ship, filling its hull with concrete to form a stable, wave-washed foundation for a towering lighthouse. This island beacon became the final, guiding symbol of the empire's new lifeline. Claudius's harbor was a monumental achievement, but it soon revealed a familiar enemy, Silt. The circular basin, for all its size, began to fill with sediment carried by coastal currents. The machine was faltering. Half a century later, Emperor Trajan provided the definitive upgrade, that perfected the system. Inland from Claudius's basin, he ordered the excavation of a second, even more magnificent harbor, a perfect hexagon. This geometric marvel was not just for show. Each of its 6 sides provided an immense length of docking space, allowing multiple ships to unload simultaneously. Canals connected this hexagonal basin to Claudius's outer harbor and, crucially, to the Tiber River. Now the machine had distinct, specialized components. The outer breakwaters and circular basin handled the brute force work of storm protection and initial reception from the open sea. The hexagonal basin became the calm, controlled sorting hub. A grain freighter from Alexandria would enter the outer harbor, then be towed through a canal into the geometric perfection of Trajan's port. There, in water of a guaranteed depth, its cargo of Egyptian wheat would be unloaded directly into the warehouses that lined the quays. From those warehouses, the grain was transferred onto smaller, shallow-draft river barges for the short, final journey up the Tiber to the warehouses of Rome itself. This was intermodal transport engineered 2,000 years ago, a seamless transfer from sea ship to river barge with minimal delay or loss. Had one purpose: to secure the grain dole that fed Rome's free citizen population. Its success was measured in quiet streets and full stomachs. By guaranteeing this most basic need, the harbor became the unseen foundation of political stability for centuries. It demonstrated, in stone and concrete, that the power of an empire was not just in its legions or its laws, but in its ability to reorganize the physical world to sustain the lives of its people. Turn the chaotic, storm-tossed act of seaborne supply into a predictable, administrative routine. It was the ultimate expression of the Roman genius for logistics, a genius that began not with a ledger but with a dredge, and not with a law but with a breakwater. Proving that the way to rule a continent was to first command your own coastline. While Rome was perfecting its concrete machine another gateway was flourishing under a different sun, powered by a different rhythm. Far across the Indian Ocean, on the lush, monsoon-swept coast of Kerala, a port achieved legendary status not through imperial decree, but through the sheer magnetism of its cargo. This was the fabled gateway to the Spice Lands, a name that echoed in Roman markets and Tamil poetry alike. For centuries, it was more myth than map. A glittering prize mentioned in scrolls but vanished from the landscape, its exact location a whispered secret lost to time. The mystery is not just about finding a lost city, it is about understanding a different kind of harbor genius. One that mastered the seasonal pulse of the wind and the silty flow of rivers to create a bridge between continents. Roman merchants and poets spoke of with a kind of awe, calling it the premier emporium of the East. Its docks were said to overflow with mountains of black pepper, the black gold of antiquity, alongside precious gems, ivory, and fine silks. In exchange, ships from the Roman Empire brought gold coin, wine, and fine glassware. This was not casual trade. It was a high-stakes, intercontinental exchange that linked the forums of Rome directly to the palm-shaded backwaters of South India. The Greco-Roman guidebook, known as the Of the Sea, provides a sailor's manual to this route, detailing the voyage from Egyptian Red Sea ports across the Arabian Sea, driven by the predictable summer monsoon winds. Straight to the riches of, yet for all its detail, could not tell modern archaeologists where to dig. The port seemed to have been swallowed by the very landscape that once nurtured it. The breakthrough began not with a grand breakwater, but with fragments in the soil. At a site called, archaeologists began unearthing a story written in pottery shards, ancient teak timbers, and a single stunning artifact, a Roman amphora filled with wine residue. The evidence painted a picture of a bustling settlement from the right period, with trade goods spanning from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. This was almost certainly, but the geography presented a puzzle. The Kerala coast is a network of rivers, lagoons, and shifting sandbars, not a place of deep, natural bays. So how did the large, ocean-going Roman merchant ships, some capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo, find safe haven here? The answer lies in a sophisticated, less monumental form of harbor engineering. Was almost certainly a riverine port, a managed facility on the banks of the river estuary. Unlike the colossal concrete arms of Caesarea, its infrastructure was likely built from wood and earth, materials that leave faint traces. Archaeologists propose that its engineers constructed long wooden wharves and jetties extending into the deeper channels of the river, creating stable platforms for loading and unloading away from the muddy banks. They would have engaged in constant, careful dredging of the main river approach, using methods similar to those in the Mediterranean, to maintain a navigable channel for deep-draft vessels. The goal was to funnel the powerful monsoon-driven ships from the open ocean into a calm highway, where goods could be transferred to smaller local boats for distribution inland. This was harbor as a careful conversation with a fluid landscape, adapting to the river's flow rather than fighting the sea's fury. The success of reveals a profound truth about artificial harbors. Their form was dictated by local need and material. Where Rome had abundant volcanic ash for concrete, Kerala had abundant timber and skilled knowledge of hydraulic management. The result was equally effective, a gateway that operated on a seasonal clock set by the monsoons. For months, ships would arrive, the port would erupt in activity, and then it would settle into a quieter period of maintenance and preparation. This cyclical rhythm created a unique cultural and economic zone, a place where Tamil merchants negotiated directly with Roman traders, where local deities stood alongside imported Roman lamps, and where the pepper that seasoned a feast in Pompeii began its journey on a wooden dock in a river estuary. Did not defy coastal geography with brute force. It collaborated with a different set of natural rules, proving that the drive to build a gateway could flourish in any language of engineering. Its forgotten wharves were the silent, crucial link in a chain of desire that stretched across the known world. A testament to the fact that the scent of pepper could motivate harbor-building ambition as powerfully as the demand for imperial grain. The Mediterranean's gentle pulse was a geographic luxury. Its tides, mere whispers of vertical change, allowed engineers to design harbors with a sense of permanence, their grand entrances forever open to a sea that rose and fell only by inches. This was harbor building on a stable stage, but step beyond the Strait of Gibraltar or sail into the North Sea, and the rules of the game transformed completely. Here, the ocean breathed with a colossal rhythm, with tidal ranges that could exceed 10 meters, the height of a 3-story building. This daily cycle of immense revelation and concealment presented a fundamentally different set of challenges for any civilization trying to build a lasting gateway to the sea. At low tide, a carefully dredged basin could become a trap, leaving ships stranded in a sea of stinking mud, helpless until the water returned hours later. At high tide, the rush of water in and out of narrow channels could generate ferocious currents, turning a harbor entrance into a raging torrent capable of snapping mooring lines or dashing a vessel against the quay. The static, monumental logic of the Mediterranean breakwater was insufficient here. Success required a dynamic partnership with the tide itself, a philosophy of engineering that saw this powerful movement not as an enemy, but as a potential source of energy and order. We see this adaptive genius apart. In the Indus Valley, the solution was the locked, tidal basin, a geometric pool that captured the high tide and held it prisoner for work. Centuries later and continents away, the Saxon and Viking traders of northern Europe faced similar conditions. Their trading ports, known as wick settlements, were often situated on the upper reaches of tidal rivers. They built long, wooden landing stages that projected out over the mudflats, structures designed to accommodate the dramatic rise and fall of the water. A ship could tie up at high tide, unload directly onto the wharf, and when the tide retreated, it would settle safely onto the reinforced riverbed, awaiting the next cycle to float free. The harbor here was not a fixed space of water, but a time-based facility, its usability scheduled by the moon. The most sophisticated adaptation, however, was to harness the tidal flow as a natural cleaning service. Engineers building in river estuaries would carefully align their channels and basins so that the powerful ebb and flood currents would scour away accumulating silt, performing the dredging work automatically. This required an intimate understanding of local hydrology, of how water moved around a particular bend in the river, or how a sandbar shifted with the seasons. The design philosophy was one of guided flow, not imposed barrier. This fundamental divergence in approach between the tideless Mediterranean and the tidal oceans reveals a crucial truth. Artificial harbor engineering was never a single technology exported from a center of power. It was a global toolkit of principles, a language of problem-solving spoken in different dialects. Whether using concrete to create permanence from chaos in a tideless sea, or using wooden gates and tidal rhythms to create order from a cyclical landscape, the goal was identical. To build a node of safety and exchange in a world where geography was the first and greatest negotiator. The choice of technique was simply a conversation with the local water, a testament to human ingenuity's ability to find not one answer, but many. To the same eternal question of how to secure a place upon the waves, the blueprint for an artificial harbor is a document of ambition, but its construction site was a theater of endurance. Behind every ton of stone and every concrete block sunk into the surf stood not just an engineer's mind, but an ocean of human effort, much of it compelled. The sublime geometry of these ports, their perfect curves and sheltering arms, rests upon a foundation that history often omits, the immense and frequently coerced labor of countless unnamed individuals. To move the mountains of material required, states drew upon their most direct sources of manpower: slaves captured in war, prisoners condemned to hard labor, and citizens bound by obligations. A form of tax paid not in coin, but in days of compulsory work for the king or the empire. The accounts of Herod the Great's frantic construction of Caesarea hint at this scale, mentioning the mobilization of a vast workforce, a small city of laborers transplanted to the empty coast. Their task was the physical translation of a king's dream into rock and mortar, a process of relentless, grinding exertion. Imagine the chain of toil, beginning in the dust-choked air of a quarry miles inland. Teams would toil under the sun, hammering wedges into limestone faces to pry loose blocks larger than a man. Then came the Herculean logistics of transport, moving these monstrous weights overland on sledges and rollers, a slow, creaking procession vulnerable to accident and collapse. The final stage was the most perilous, working in the dynamic, unforgiving environment of the sea itself. Placing foundation stones on a shifting seabed, maneuvering heavy wooden forms for concrete pours in choppy water, or diving to clear obstructions, all were tasks performed without modern safety equipment. The risk of injury from falling stone, drowning in a sudden surge, or being crushed by shifting loads was a constant shadow over the work. While we rightly celebrate the visionary engineers who designed these harbors, the anonymous multitude who realized those visions with their hands and their backs are largely absent from the record. Their names are not inscribed on the monuments they built, their stories are not preserved in the chronicles of kings. Yet to acknowledge this dimension is to see these harbors in their full, sobering reality. They were triumphs of collective human will, yes, but also testaments to the social structures and often harsh demands of the ancient world. The calm water of the finished basin was bought with more than architectural genius. It was purchased with an incalculable measure of effort, hardship, and sacrifice. This understanding does not diminish the engineering marvel, but rather deepens it, framing these geographical defiances not as effortless acts of power, but as hard-won victories. Written in stone and in the silent legacy of those who moved it, this engineered micro-city announced its presence long before a ship ever touched the quay. Rising from the tip of an artificial island or the end of a massive breakwater, the lighthouse was the harbor's voice in the darkness, its first and most vital piece of architecture. The most legendary, the Pharos of Alexandria, was more than a navigational aid. It was a revolutionary idea made solid. Its great fire, amplified by polished metal mirrors, projected a beam visible for miles, cutting through the blackness of the Mediterranean night. This transformed navigation from a dangerous gamble into a guided journey. A captain, after weeks at sea, would scan the horizon not just for land, but for that specific man-made star, a guaranteed signal that safety, fresh water, and a market lay just beyond its glow. The lighthouse was a promise kept in flame and stone, the ultimate symbol that this place was different, that here, human order had tamed the primal fear of the unseen shore. Once a ship passed that beacon and slipped into the calm basin, it entered a world of orchestrated efficiency. Dominating the waterfront were the massive warehouses. These were not simple sheds, but sophisticated machines for preservation. In ports like Ostia, their thick, windowless walls of brick and concrete were designed for thermal mass, maintaining a cool, stable temperature inside. Raised floors, supported by rows of small pillars, allowed air to circulate beneath stacks of grain sacks, preventing rot and discouraging pests. Elaborate systems of vents and courtyards ensured a constant, gentle airflow. Here, the wealth of empires was rendered inert and stable. Egyptian wheat, Spanish olive oil, and North African wine held in suspended animation until needed by the distant metropolis. The warehouse was the harbor's stomach, and its careful design ensured the life of the city it fed. Yet this commercial heartbeat was framed by the sacred. At the very edge of the engineered stone, where the works of man met the untamed sea, stood the temples. These were not hidden away, but prominently placed on headlands or grand platforms overlooking the harbor entrance. They were dedicated to deities who commanded the waves, like the Greek Poseidon or the Egyptian Isis, who was revered as protector of sailors. Before a voyage, captains and merchants would make offerings, seeking favor for a safe passage. After a harrowing journey, they would return with votive gifts, small clay models of ships or inscribed plaques, giving thanks for their deliverance. This ritual practice was a crucial psychological layer to the harbor's function. The breakwater provided physical safety, but the temple offered spiritual assurance, acknowledging the forces that even the greatest engineering could not fully control. It was a bridge between human confidence and humble reverence. Filling the space between these spiritual and storage districts was the bustling apparatus of daily governance. Customs houses hummed with activity as clerks assessed duties on incoming cargo, their records etched on wax tablets or papyrus scrolls. Administrative buildings housed port authorities who coordinated docking rights, maintained the infrastructure, and settled disputes between merchants from a dozen different cultures. Just beyond the quays, open-air markets exploded with the immediate trade in fresh goods, ship supplies, and the small luxuries sailors sought after months at sea. Every element, from the lighthouse to the temple to the customs seal, served a dedicated purpose within a single, integrated system. This was not a city that happened to have a port. It was a port that had grown a complete city around its core function. The artificial harbor, therefore, achieved its final triumph not just in hydrology, but in urban design. It demonstrated that to truly master the chaotic interface of land and sea, you had to build an entire world there, a complete, self-contained capsule of civilization where every stone, from the foundation to the altar, whispered the same message of calculated order. The final destination was a calm basin, but the journey of its stones began in a world of dust and deafening noise. To build a harbor, you first had to move a mountain, one colossal block at a time. The supply chain for these megaprojects was a marvel of logistics that unfolded far from the coast, in the quiet hills where limestone and granite slept. Masters of geometry and force would identify a seam in the bedrock. Using wooden wedges hammered into carefully drilled holes, they would soak the wood until it expanded, creating immense pressure that cracked the stone along a clean line, freeing a block that could weigh as much as 50 tons. The equivalent of 10 adult elephants, this raw monolith was just the beginning of an epic, slow-motion journey. The real challenge was not cutting the stone, but convincing it to travel. A 50-ton block does not roll, it resists. Ancient engineers answered this resistance with a symphony of simple machines and coordinated effort. They would first lever the block onto a massive wooden sledge. Beneath this sledge, they placed a path of lubricated wooden rollers, perhaps greased with animal fat or water. Teams of oxen, or lines of laborers chanting in unison, would then pull on ropes attached to the sledge, inching the immense weight forward. As the block moved, workers at the back would rush to retrieve the rollers that had passed underneath and run them to the front, creating a continuous, moving road. This procession crawled along specially prepared causeways, roads reinforced to bear the unbelievable load. The journey from quarry to coast could take weeks, a creeping parade of stone that transformed the landscape into a slow river of ambition. Reaching the water's edge was only half the battle. Now the stone had to learn to float. For this, engineers turned the sea into their ally. They constructed enormous, reinforced barges or lashed together pontoons to create stable floating platforms. Using ramps, levers, and perhaps the rising tide itself, they would maneuver the sledge and its stone cargo onto this makeshift vessel. The loading operation alone was a delicate ballet of physics, where one wrong calculation could sink the barge and send the priceless block to the bottom. Once secured, the barge would be towed by rowboats or guided by sails to the precise location of the rising breakwater. There, the most perilous transfer awaited. Divers might descend to prepare the seabed, while crews above used a system of ropes, cranes, and counterweights to tilt the barge or slide the stone off, aiming for its predetermined spot in the growing underwater puzzle. Each placement was a calculated risk, with the open sea always waiting to turn precision into chaos. The Romans, with their concrete technology, sometimes bypassed this stone-by-stone struggle altogether. Their method was one of liquid transformation. Workers would build enormous wooden box forms on shore, then float them out to the construction site. These floating boxes were sunk into position and anchored. Then, via a fleet of smaller boats, the magical mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and aggregate was poured directly into the forms beneath the waves. The chemistry of curing did the rest, hardening the slurry into a single, seamless mass of artificial stone that bonded to the seabed. This was harbor-building alchemy, turning loose rubble and powder into permanent geography. Behind every stone set and every concrete pour stood an invisible framework just as impressive as the engineering, the framework of management. Coordinating the ox drivers, the barge pilots, the divers, and the masons required a bureaucratic machine of remarkable efficiency. Someone had to schedule the quarry output so that stones arrived at the coast in the right sequence. Someone had to ensure the barges were in position when the transport crews arrived. Someone had to feed and house the army of laborers. This was project management on an imperial scale, a relentless flow of materials, men, and instructions that turned 1,000 individual tasks into a single, rising structure. The quiet order of the administrative ledger made possible the roaring disorder of the construction site. Before the first ship ever found shelter in the calm water, years were spent in a world of dust, sweat, and shouting, a hidden world of monumental effort where the true foundation of the harbor was not stone, but the unwavering human will to move it. They never wrote a textbook on fluid dynamics, but they could read the language of the sea in the foam of a breaking wave. Ancient harbor engineers were master observers, their classrooms the wind-whipped coastline and the shifting sands of the seabed. Their greatest designs emerged not from abstract theory, but from a deep, accumulated wisdom written in the scars of failed projects and the quiet success of those that stood the test of time. This was a science of the senses, a hydraulic intelligence built through generations of watching, learning, and adapting. Consider the simple, powerful curve of a breakwater. From above, many ancient moles appear as graceful arcs or angled arms, not straight walls. This was likely no aesthetic choice. A builder who spent a lifetime watching storms would see how a wave crashing head-on into a flat surface creates a violent, reflected backwash, churning the water just inside the entrance into a dangerous soup. But a wave meeting a curved or sloped face, its energy is gradually redirected, deflected along the contour, and dissipated. That gentle curve was a direct translation of observed physics into stone, a way of persuading the ocean's force to slide harmlessly aside rather than meet it in a shattering confrontation. The placement of the harbor mouth itself was a decision of life or death, dictated by an intimate knowledge of local weather. Engineers did not just pick the shortest distance to deep water. They studied the seasonal winds, the prevailing winds that would fill a ship's sails for a smooth entry, and the storm winds that could pin a vessel against a lee shore. The entrance was always positioned, whenever possible, so that the most common and gentle winds would be at a ship's back as it entered, acting as a natural pilot into the calm. Conversely, it was angled to present its narrowest profile, to the direction of the worst winter gales and the powerful swell they generated, minimizing how much of that chaotic energy could funnel directly into the basin. This was strategic alignment with the atmosphere itself. Perhaps the most sophisticated application of this empirical science was in the silent war against silt. At Magna, the entire artificial harbor basin was not dug as a simple rectangle. Archaeologists note it was deliberately angled in relation to the coastline. Why? The prevailing longshore current in that part of the Mediterranean sweeps along the North African shore, carrying a constant load of sand. By angling the basin and its entrance channel, the engineers essentially used that current as a natural cleaning service. As water flowed along the coast, it would be guided into the harbor mouth, circulate through the basin, and then be channeled out again, carrying suspended sediment with it before it could settle on the bottom. They were not fighting the current, they were recruiting it. They turned a natural force of deposition into an agent of maintenance. This entire body of knowledge, this maritime intuition, was a living library. It was not held in a single scroll, but in the collective memory of guilds of builders, passed from master to apprentice over centuries. A young engineer learned not just how to cut stone, but how to read the color of the water for depth, how to feel the wind shift, and how to listen to the stories of old sailors about which coves offered shelter in which seasons. Each new project added a chapter. Each storm that damaged a structure provided a harsh but invaluable lesson. Their success was proof that a deep, functional understanding of nature can be built through relentless, careful attention, long before the underlying principles are given formal names. They solved differential equations written by the ocean, using the slow, sure calculus of observation and stone. A harbor was a king's signature written upon the water. These colossal works of engineering transcended their practical purpose to become the ultimate political statements, stone and concrete proclamations of legitimacy, power, and divine favor. When a ruler could reshape the coastline itself, he was demonstrating a command over nature that bordered on the godlike. This symbolic power was woven into every aspect of the harbor, starting with its very name. A natural cove might be called after a local feature, but an artificial port was christened as a personal monument. Caesarea bore the name of Caesar Augustus, the name of Emperor Trajan. These were not subtle nods. They were permanent claims of ownership over the gateway to the world, ensuring that every merchant and sailor who uttered the port's name also invoked the patron who built it. The connection to the divine was equally explicit and strategic. Temples to patron deities were not afterthoughts tucked away in back streets. They were centerpieces of the waterfront, positioned at the harbor mouth or on prominent breakwaters. Before daring the open sea, a captain would make an offering at the shrine of Poseidon or Isis, goddess of sailors seeking protection. Upon safe return, he would give thanks. This ritual practice served a dual purpose. For the sailor, it provided spiritual assurance in a perilous profession. For the ruler who funded the temple, it created a powerful association. By providing the sacred space where mortals negotiated with the gods of the deep, the king or emperor positioned himself as the essential intermediary, the one who made that divine conversation possible. He was not just building breakwaters, he was building the infrastructure of favor. The grand inauguration of a new harbor was a ceremonial event of the highest order, a piece of political theater staged at the intersection of land and sea. Imagine the scene at the dedication of Caesarea. Dignitaries in fine robes would gather on the newly finished quays. The fleet, polished and bedecked with banners, would parade into the pristine basin. Priests would conduct sacrifices, calling upon the gods to bless this new conquest over chaos. The ruler would give a speech, framing the engineering marvel not as a difficult construction project, but as a gift to the people, a testament to his prosperous reign and his commitment to their safety and wealth. It was a live broadcast of power, designed to be remembered and recounted. This was because the harbor's most potent symbolism was profoundly practical. In the ancient social contract, a ruler's legitimacy hinged on his ability to provide two fundamental things: security and sustenance. An artificial harbor delivered both in the most visible way possible. Its fortified walls and sheltered basin guaranteed security for the ships that were the lifeblood of the state. More crucially, by ensuring the safe, reliable arrival of grain shipments from across the sea, the harbor guaranteed food. The grain dole that fed the masses of Rome was the ultimate proof of effective governance. The calm waters of were, therefore, directly linked to the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. A full stomach meant a quiet city, and a quiet city meant a stable throne. The harbor was the critical, engineered link in this chain of stability. In a worldview where the untamed ocean represented primordial chaos, danger, and the unknown, the artificial harbor stood as its absolute opposite. It was a geometric bubble of perfect human order, imposed upon the formless deep. The straight lines of its quays, the perfect curve of its breakwater, the regulated depth of its basin, all spoke of control, rationality, and prosperity. To look from a stormy sea into the serene waters of a man-made port was to witness the triumph of civilization over nature. For a visiting ambassador or a subject citizen, this was not just an impressive feat, it was a compelling argument. A dynasty that could perform such a miracle had clearly earned its mandate to rule, blessed by the gods and backed by an engineering prowess that could literally hold back the sea. The harbor was their most persuasive advertisement, a silent, enduring stone sermon on the divine right of kings, built not to be read, but to be sailed into. The stone arms that calmed the waves also redirected the very life of the coast. For every action taken to secure a harbor, the surrounding environment reacted in turn, a chain of unintended consequences that ancient planners could observe but not fully comprehend. Reshaping geography on such a monumental scale meant intervening in systems of water, sand, and life that had been in balance for. The most immediate and visible impact was on the dance of sediment along the shoreline. A long breakwater is a massive obstacle in the path of coastal currents, which constantly move sand and silt parallel to the shore. When that current met the unyielding stone of a new mole, it was forced to slow down. Like a river dropping its load when its flow decreases, the current would deposit its cargo of sand on the side of the breakwater, building new beaches where none existed before. This seemed a bonus, a gift of new land. But for any port or settlement located, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. Starved of the nourishing sand that once fed its beaches, that coastline would begin to erode, its protective sands washing away to reveal vulnerable bedrock. One city's engineered safety could literally be washing the ground out from under its neighbors' feet, a zero-sum game of coastal real estate played out over generations. Within the harbor basin itself, a different kind of transformation occurred. The very calm that made these ports so valuable came at an ecological cost. Natural coastlines are dynamic places where waves oxygenate the water and currents flush out organic material. An artificial harbor, with its restricted entrance and still waters, lost that natural flushing action. The waste of a concentrated urban population, along with the organic debris from hundreds of ships, would settle to the bottom of the basin. Over time, this could lead to a process called eutrophication, where decomposing matter consumes oxygen and alters the chemistry of the water. The clear, healthy sea within the walls could gradually become a sluggish, oxygen-poor environment, unsuitable for many marine species that once thrived there. While ancient observers would not have understood the biochemistry, they would have noticed the changes, perhaps in fewer fish, in unusual smells emanating from the water on hot days, or in the faster accumulation of foul-smelling muck that required constant, expensive dredging to remove. The alteration of habitats extended beyond the water's edge. The new, deep basins and sheer concrete walls created a completely alien landscape on the, replacing natural sandy slopes or rocky reefs with geometric hard surfaces. This did not erase life, but it dramatically shifted which life could prosper. Species adapted to clinging to hard surfaces, like certain mollusks, algae, and barnacles, would flourish, covering the breakwaters in a living crust. Other creatures that depended on soft sediments for burrowing or feeding might vanish from the area. The harbor became a marine ecosystem of human design, favoring a different, often less diverse, suite of organisms. Furthermore, the constant traffic of ships acted as an unwitting vector for invasive species, as hulls coated in marine life from one sea region could transport those organisms to a new harbor thousands of miles away, subtly rewriting local ecologies with every voyage. The ancient builders were, of course, most acutely aware of the problem that directly threatened their investment: siltation. Even the most brilliantly designed harbor, with its sluice gates and circulating currents, was engaged in a perpetual, losing battle against the land's desire to reclaim the water. Rivers continued to carry their burdens of eroded soil to the sea. Each storm stirred up the seabed. This sediment sought the water to settle in, which was, invariably, the expensive basin they had just excavated. The history of these ports is often a history of their slow suffocation. The grand circular basin of Claudius at, the innovative channels of Caesarea, even the mighty works of the Phoenicians, all eventually succumbed to this relentless, granular pressure. The maintenance dredging was a tax paid in labor to geography, a reminder that their control was provisional. When political will or economic power faltered and the dredging stopped, the harbor's death sentence was sealed. Within a few decades, what was a bustling gateway could become a swamp, and then solid land, leaving ruins stranded far from the modern shoreline. These projects stand, therefore, as profound early chapters in the ongoing story of humanity's relationship with the planet's fragile edges. They demonstrate a recurring pattern, where solving one urgent human problem, like the need for safe maritime trade, can create a cascade of secondary environmental effects that unfold over centuries. The ancient engineers were brilliant problem solvers within their frame of reference, but their frame did not include the concept of an interconnected ecosystem. They saw a hydrodynamic challenge to be overcome, not a web of life to be preserved. Yet in their struggles with silt, in the unintended erosion of neighboring coasts, and in the altered waters of their own basins, they encountered the fundamental truth that large-scale infrastructure is not a one-time imposition on nature, but the beginning of a long, complex, and often costly conversation. Their legacy is not just in the stones we can still see, but in the invisible, enduring lessons written in the very shape of the coastlines they changed forever. A harbor's blueprint was a secret too valuable to keep. The very ships that carried spices and silks also carried something more profound: the knowledge of how to build the ports that received them. This was not a formal science taught in academies, but a living craft, a set of hard-won solutions that migrated with the men who knew them. The story of how to defy the sea traveled on the same currents as trade itself, a slow, relentless diffusion that wove the ancient world into a shared technological tapestry. It began with the Phoenicians, those master mariners whose very survival depended on their engineered harbors. When they established trading colonies across the Mediterranean, from Carthage in North Africa to in Spain, they did not just bring goods, they brought their way of building. The techniques of sinking foundation stones and constructing protective moles became part of the cultural package, embedded in the new landscapes they shaped. A Greek merchant visiting a thriving Phoenician port like Tyre would see more than bustling markets. He would see a working model of maritime ambition, a physical argument for how to command a coast. This observation was the first spark of transmission. Greek architects, pragmatic and brilliant, were keen students. They saw the Phoenician approach and refined it with their own passion for geometry and planning. The transformation of Piraeus from a rocky bay into a fortified, multi-harbor complex was a leap forward, applying systematic thought to the Phoenician foundation. But the true vector for spreading this enhanced knowledge was the campaign of a single man, Alexander the Great. His conquests shattered old boundaries, and in their wake, his engineers became agents of technological transfer. These were the builders who laid out Alexandria on a barren strip between the sea and a lake, men who carried the accumulated harbor wisdom of the Greek world into Egypt. Under Alexander's successor, Ptolemy, they executed the staggering, a project that synthesized Greek planning with the scale of an empire. Suddenly, the most advanced harbor engineering in the Mediterranean had a new, dazzling showcase. From Alexandria, the ideas radiated outward, studied and adapted by anyone who wished to compete in the new Hellenistic world of commerce. Rome, ever the pragmatic assimilator, observed all of this. Roman engineers were not proud inventors in this field, they were brilliant perfectionists. They absorbed the Greek and Hellenistic principles of harbor layout, the importance of deep basins and protective moles. Then they supercharged it with their own revolutionary material, hydraulic concrete, and their unmatched talent for large-scale organization. The result was Portus-like, a machine of such complexity it seemed to bend nature to administrative will, but Rome's genius was in replication. Once perfected, this Roman model of harbor engineering became a standard package, deployed across the vast geography of the empire. From the cold waters of Britannia, where they built a sheltered port to the distant shores of the Black Sea, the same principles appeared. Engineers following legionary standards could construct a functioning, familiar port almost anywhere, using local materials when concrete was not available, but always applying the same core logic of breakwater. Basin and quay. It was technological imperialism, ensuring that every corner of the empire was plugged into the same maritime network, speaking the same language of stone and wave. Far from the Roman world, in the monsoon-driven trade of the Indian Ocean, a different kind of knowledge exchange was occurring. Here, there were no imperial legions to standardize construction, but the networks of commerce were just as effective. A merchant sailor from the Persian Gulf, familiar with the tidal harbors of his homeland, would spend months in a port like on the Indian coast. He would observe how local builders used timber and earth to manage the powerful river currents and shifting sandbars. Years later, a trader from the Tamil kingdoms might make the reverse journey, noting the construction of harbors in the Red Sea. The transmission was likely silent, a matter of observation and gradual imitation rather than formal instruction. A successful design feature, like a method for reinforcing a wooden jetty against worm infestation, or a clever way to align a channel with the tidal scour, would prove its worth simply by working. Over generations, These practical insights could circulate from the Swahili coast to the islands of Southeast Asia, adapted endlessly to local conditions. The proof is in the pattern, not the parchment, a family resemblance in harbor solutions across thousands of miles of ocean. This global conversation was carried by people, not documents. While written manuals, like those attributed to the Greek engineer of Byzantium, may have existed, the most vital transfer happened person to person. It was the migrating master craftsman, hired by a foreign king desperate for a grand port to match his rivals. It was the captured engineer, whose skills spared his life and found new application in a conqueror's service. It was the community of sailors and shipwrights, who understood the sea's demands intimately and could advise on what made a haven truly safe. They shared a common vocabulary of problems: the need to dissipate wave energy, the fight against silt, the requirement for deep, stable berths. A successful harbor in one location became a compelling argument for its design, a three-dimensional template that invited replication. This slow-motion diffusion of innovation was perhaps the most lasting legacy of these ancient trade routes. They did more than move goods, they moved ideas, binding disparate civilizations together not just by what they traded, but by the shared, monumental language they used to make that trade possible. The stone breakwater in Gaul and the timber jetty in India were distant cousins, their family connection traced not by blood, but by the universal human need to find safety upon the water. The concrete of Rome cured into a permanent geography of trade, but the empire that poured it did not last. As the centralized authority that built and maintained Magna fragmented, the age of monumental harbor construction in Europe came to a sudden halt. The immense capital, organization, and technical guilds required for such projects evaporated, yet the stone itself did not vanish. The great artificial harbors, now orphaned from their imperial patrons, entered a new, long chapter as inherited assets. Their weathered breakwaters and silted basins becoming the foundational grammar upon which medieval maritime worlds were slowly written. The ports did not die with Rome, they simply changed hands. In the east, the magnificent double harbor of Constantinople, originally a Greek foundation massively expanded by Roman and Byzantine emperors, never ceased its function. Its legendary chain stretched across the Golden Horn, its fortified walls repelling sieges for 1,000 years. It became the indispensable heart of the Byzantine Empire, a Christian capital whose lifeblood flowed through a pagan and Roman engineered gateway. Similarly, along the coasts of North Africa, the sophisticated Roman ports were not abandoned. They were occupied, repaired, and recalibrated by Islamic caliphates. Barcelona's maritime importance rests squarely upon its Roman harbor foundations, which Umayyad and later Catalan rulers adapted and expanded. The knowledge embedded in those stones was too valuable to discard, a ready-made infrastructure of power that new rulers could occupy and claim as their own. This inheritance was not passive. In the absence of empire-wide building campaigns, the engineering knowledge persisted in localized, ingenious forms. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Venetian lagoon. Here, a people with no natural dry land became the heirs to the ancient philosophy of environmental defiance. Faced with a shallow, tidal marsh, Venetian engineers did not build breakwaters against the open sea, but instead mastered the interior waters. They drove millions of wooden piles into the soft sediment to create stable foundations for their city, a forest of timber holding up a marble republic. They dredged canals to serve as navigable streets and constructed to protect against storm surges. This was harbor thinking applied to an entire urban organism, a direct conceptual descendant of the Roman will to create land from water. Far to the north, in the Low Countries facing the North Sea, a different kind of inheritance played out. The Frisian and Dutch builders of dikes and polders were engaged in the same fundamental struggle as the engineers of Caesarea, but on a defensive, agricultural scale. Their systems of reclaiming land from the sea by building barriers and managing water levels through sluices and windmills applied the ancient principles of hydraulic control to a new, collective purpose. The knowledge of how to hold back the water, how to negotiate with tides and sediments, had been fractured and dispersed, but its core logic survived in these pockets of necessity. Most profoundly, the physical footprint of an ancient artificial harbor often became an unbreakable mold for urban growth. The street grid of a modern city like or Naples often curls in a telltale arc, following the line of a Roman or Greek mole that has long since been buried beneath centuries of landfill and development. The medieval city wall was frequently built just inland from the ancient waterfront, because that's where the original, valuable infrastructure was. Later expansions simply extended from that hard, historical kernel. The ancient harbor's location decided where the cathedral, the market, and the ducal palace would rise, channeling the flow of history for 1,000 years after its builders' names were forgotten. This is the longest shadow of their defiance. It was not merely that their stones were reused, but that their initial, radical act of geographical choice became permanent. By deciding that a particular stretch of open coast would become a gateway, they magnetized all future human activity to that spot. The medieval merchant, the Renaissance admiral, and the modern shipping conglomerate all still sail to places that were first carved out of the wilderness by engineers working for pharaohs, Phoenician kings, and Roman emperors. The map of the modern world's great port cities is, in many ways, a palimpsest, with the faint but indelible ink of ancient ambition still visible beneath the bustling modern text. Their legacy is the very shape of our coasts, a silent, stony argument that some human decisions, once made in concrete and colossal effort, can literally set the stage for all that follows. The story of reshaping the coast was not a Mediterranean monopoly. Far across the continent, under different skies and driven by different imperial rhythms, the same fundamental urge to engineer maritime destiny flourished along the river deltas and monsoon coasts of Asia. Here, the solutions were not written in Roman concrete, but in the logic of canals, silt-laden rivers, and the strategic choke points of global trade winds. While the Qin and Han dynasties of ancient China directed their colossal organizational power inward, mastering the continent with monumental canal projects like the which connected river basins to move troops and grain, their gaze on the open ocean was more measured. The primary theater for Chinese hydraulic genius was the riverine world, a network of controlled waterways that bound the empire together. Yet, the sea's call would not be ignored forever. Centuries later, during the brilliant commercial flourishing of the Song dynasty, a coastal city would rise to answer it with stone and ambition. That city was known to the world as. Nestled on a deep bay in Fujian province, its natural advantages were enhanced on a staggering scale. The Song engineers constructed massive stone breakwaters, some records suggesting over 15 kilometers of them, reaching out to tame the Taiwan Strait's swells. They dredged deep channels and built fortified quays, transforming the harbor into a protected metropolis of trade. At its zenith was a humming, polyglot worldport, a terminus of the maritime Silk Road where Chinese porcelain and silk met spices, gems, and ideas from across the Indian Ocean and beyond. Its very name became synonymous with satin in languages from Arabic to Portuguese, a testament to its reach. This was artificial harbor engineering adapted to a Chinese context, less about projecting legionary power and more about facilitating and taxing the immense, private energy of oceanic commerce. It proved that, when the economic incentive grew powerful enough, even an empire focused on its rivers would turn its engineers seaward to carve a gateway of its own. Meanwhile, in the humid archipelagos of Southeast Asia, a different model of maritime control emerged, one built on geography's most precious accidental gifts. From the 7th century, the empire, based on the island of Sumatra, commanded not through colossal port construction, but through the strategic enhancement of nature's own design. Their power centered on places like Palembang, a city built along the muddy, shifting banks of the river. This was not a deepwater seaport in the Mediterranean sense, but a brilliant adaptation. Rulers likely engineered this rivermouth complex, reinforcing banks, building wooden wharves far out into the tidal channels, and dredging to maintain access for deep-draft trading ships. Their genius was location. Palembang sat just south of the Strait of Malacca, the narrow funnel through which all monsoon-driven trade between China and India had to pass. By perfecting this riverine port, controlled the vital pause in the journey, the place where ships waited for wind shifts, resupplied and paid taxes. They built their empire not on a fortified breakwater against the open sea, but on the managed mud of a strategic estuary, mastering the logistics of choke point economics. The imperative was universal, but the expression was local. Whether in the stone arms of Song dynasty or the enhanced river ports of, the pattern repeats. A society ascends by securing a reliable point of exchange upon the water. They read their unique geography, a deep bay, a strategic river mouth, and they asked the same question as the Phoenician or Roman engineer. How can we make this place more than it is? How can we turn this water into a door? The answers, from the South China Sea to the Strait of Malacca, whisper the same truth. The drive to build a harbor was not the invention of one civilization, but a recurring discovery, a logical step for any culture whose eyes were on the horizon and whose wealth was waiting on the tide. The stone is still there, but the water has taken its story. To truly understand these engineered harbors, we must follow them beneath the waves, into a world where history is written not in ink, but in the silent geometry of submerged ruins. This is the domain of underwater archaeology, a field that has utterly transformed our comprehension of these ancient megastructures. The very elements that spelled a harbor's end, the relentless sea and the choking silt, become its greatest preservers, locking secrets away in a cold, dark vault for modern technology acts as our key. From the surface, side-scan sonar paints ghostly images of revealing the long, straight lines of a sunken breakwater or the perfect curve of a drowned quay where only natural rock should be. These are the skeletons of ambition, now home to forests of coral and shifting sands. Closer in, photogrammetry allows divers to take thousands of overlapping photographs, which software stitches into precise, three-dimensional digital models. We can now swim through a virtual reconstruction of a harbor entrance, examining each moss-covered block from every angle without ever disturbing the sight. The data is breathtaking, a pixel-perfect map of a forgotten coastline. The harbors themselves, those dredged basins that were once bustling with life, hold perhaps the most intimate clues. As they silted up and were abandoned, the sediment acted like a time capsule, sealing a moment in place. Within that deep, anaerobic mud, organic materials that would have vanished on land survive. Think of a wooden pulley from a crane, its rope still partially intact, a leather sandal lost by a dockworker, the seeds of exotic spices that spilled from a torn sack. These are not the grand monuments of kings, but the quiet, personal echoes of daily life, preserved in the very muck that engineers fought so hard to remove. Even more dramatic are the shipwrecks found within these harbors, vessels that sought final shelter in the place they called home. A merchant ship sunk at its mooring by a sudden storm provides a frozen snapshot of maritime technology and global trade. Its hull construction tells us how ships were built to withstand specific seas. Its cargo, still packed in amphorae or woven baskets, is a manifest of what was moving through that port at a precise historical moment. A single wreck is a capsule of economy, engineering, and tragedy, all resting on the harbor floor it was designed to reach. Yet for all its power, underwater archaeology is a science of profound limits, a conversation with silence. The most common harbor materials of all, wood and earth, have often vanished completely. The vast wooden pilings that supported wharves, the intricate gates of sluices, the entire framework of early jetties have usually rotted away, leaving only cryptic stains in the sediment or empty holes where they once stood. This absence forces us to read between the lines, to infer the sophistication of a system from the negative space it left behind. Furthermore, the precise artistry of construction can be blurred by time and catastrophe. A neatly laid ashlar wall, toppled by an earthquake, becomes a chaotic tumble of blocks. The subtle, intentional slope of a breakwater's face can be obscured by centuries of marine growth and collapsing rubble. We can measure what remains, but discerning the original builder's exact intention, the calculated angle meant to deflect a specific wave, becomes an exercise in cautious interpretation. The full, majestic dimensions of a harbor are often just beyond our grasp, as its outermost extremities have frequently been lost to coastal erosion or buried under modern waterfronts. The Hellenistic harbor in Cyprus stands as a poignant example of this beautiful frustration. Today, it lies completely submerged, its breakwaters visible from the air as dark lines beneath the turquoise water. Divers can swim along these immense stone arms, tracing their outline. They can find column drums and blocks scattered on the sandy bottom, clear evidence of a grand, planned port. Yet the exact configuration of its docks, the height of its quays, the system by which it managed silt, all remain elusive, hinted at by the arrangement of ruins but never fully declared. It is a masterpiece we can walk around, but whose complete blueprint is forever faded. Every descent into these silent sites is therefore an act of deciphering a complex palimpsest. The first layer is the builder's design, the intentional pattern of stone and channel. Then, time inscribes its own text, the destruction of storms, the slow sinkage of foundations, the relentless blanket of sediment. Finally, the sea itself adds a living margin, with corals, sponges, and fish transforming a human monument into a natural reef. The archaeologist must gently separate these intertwined narratives, reading the story of human ambition through the later chapters written by nature. It is painstaking, partial work, where each recovered artifact or mapped foundation stone is a single word in a vast, waterlogged epic, a story we are only now learning how to read. That same impulse to reshape the coastline now defines our modern world. The principles those ancient engineers wrestled from the sea did not vanish with their empires. They were simply written in a new language of steel, diesel, and global finance. Look at the skeleton of any major modern port, and you will see the ghost of Alexandria or staring back. The use of massive concrete caissons, lowered into place to form breakwaters, is a direct technological descendant of the sunken ship filled with concrete just executed with cranes instead of tides. The careful alignment of a harbor entrance to shield it from prevailing storms, a lesson learned from centuries of wrecked ships, is now calculated by hydrodynamic software, but the goal is identical: to create a calm threshold from chaos. Even the seamless integration of docks, rail yards, and highway interchanges around a port is the logical evolution of the Roman system where canals connected the hexagonal basin to the Tiber, creating a fluid transfer from sea ship to river barge. The ancient template of the port as a multimodal machine has been scaled to a planetary level. Perhaps the most dramatic spiritual successors are the audacious land reclamation projects of our era. The Palm Islands of Dubai are not harbors in the traditional sense, but they are ultimate acts of coastal defiance, using dredged sand to create entirely new geography for luxury and commerce. Echoing Herod's decision to build Caesarea on a barren beach. Similarly, the massive expansion of Singapore's port territory, clawing land from the sea to host the world's busiest container terminal, follows the same foundational logic as the Romans at Magna, who extended their shoreline seaward to make space for empire. The technology is unimaginably advanced, but the core ambition is timeless: to refuse the coastline you are given and invent one that serves your needs. The deepest legacy, however, is not in the concrete or the cranes, but in a mindset. Those ancient harbors established a revolutionary idea that now seems obvious: that a nation's economic destiny is not a passive gift of geography, but an active project of engineering. They proved that prosperity could be piped in through a constructed gateway. This belief underpins our entire modern existence. The global supply chain that brings a device to your hand is the direct heir of the trade routes that brought Egyptian grain to Rome or Indian pepper too. It all flows through ports, and those ports are almost universally artificial landscapes, nodes of calculated calm in the turbulent interface between land and sea. The container ship, that anonymous steel box, is the modern equivalent of the Roman grain freighter, and it requires the same engineered certainty, the same guaranteed depth and protection that the ancients fought so hard to create. We live in a world they imagined, a world where geography is a condition to be managed, not a fate to be accepted. Their stone arms in the water were the first draft of a connected planet, a draft we are still editing, on a scale they could never have dreamed. Yet for every definitive stone we recover, a dozen more whisper only questions. The field of harbor archaeology is not a library of settled facts, but a vibrant, sometimes contentious conversation, where each answer seems to unearth two new mysteries. These debates are not signs of failure, but proof of the subject's living depth, reminding us that our maps of the ancient coast are still being drawn. Take the legendary Khathon of Carthage, that secret circular naval harbor described by ancient historians. Its iconic shape has become a symbol of Carthaginian ingenuity, but was it truly a perfect circle? Modern surveys of the silted basin suggest its form might have been more complex, perhaps a rounded polygon or a shape with straightened segments for docking. The precise mechanics of its hidden operation are also debated. How did they circulate fresh water to prevent stagnation in that enclosed military basin? Where exactly were the covered ship sheds positioned on the central island? The written descriptions are tantalizing, but the physical evidence, buried under centuries of sediment and later construction, remains frustratingly partial, inviting endless reinterpretation. Closer to Rome, in the heart of, a different puzzle sits in plain sight. Alongside the vast hexagonal basin, archaeologists have uncovered a smaller, curious structure, a circular pool lined with marble. Its official purpose remains an enigma. Was it a ceremonial fountain, a reflecting pool symbolizing imperial power, a practical reservoir for the ships and workers. Or perhaps something more ingenious, a settling tank where water from the Tiber was allowed to deposit its silt before being channeled into the harbor for cleaning or drinking. This single, elegant feature underscores how even the most studied sites hold layers of intention we are still learning to read. The builders left us the engineering, but not the manual. Journeying to the Indus Valley, the precision of Tidal Dockyard raises its own profound questions. The brickwork is remarkably advanced, the concept brilliant. But how, with the technology of the time, did they achieve such exact water-level management? The design implies a sophisticated understanding of tidal ranges and hydraulic pressure. Were there more complex lock-gate mechanisms than we have evidence for, perhaps using woven barriers or weighted gates that have long since decayed? The sheer confidence of the design suggests it was the culmination of a long local tradition of water management, a tradition whose earlier steps are lost to us. Their mastery seems to appear fully formed, a silent challenge across the. Sometimes, the debate is even more fundamental, questioning the very identity of a structure. Along certain Mediterranean coasts, long linear ruins running parallel to shore have been confidently labeled as breakwaters, yet some researchers now cautiously propose alternative functions. Could some of these have been massive fish tanks, or, for wealthy Roman villas, where seawater was circulated to farm prized seafood? Might others have been part of salt production facilities, using partitioned basins to evaporate seawater? Reclassifying a breakwater as a fish tank changes the entire story of a site, shifting it from a narrative of trade and defense to one of luxury agriculture or industrial production. It forces us to look with fresh eyes, to ask not just how something was built, but what daily purpose it truly served. And then there are the ghosts, the ports that live on in historical accounts but have vanished from the landscape. The frantic search continues, with each season of excavation at sites like adding new clues, a Roman coin here, a warehouse foundation there, but the definitive footprint of the great port eludes capture. Similarly, the location of Berenice, the crucial Red Sea port that funneled Indian Ocean goods to the Nile, was only confirmed in recent decades, and its full layout is still emerging from the desert sands. These are not just academic exercises, they are hunts for the missing links in global networks, the physical anchors for stories we already know happened. Finding them literally puts history on the map. This constant state of inquiry is the lifeblood of the field. It means our understanding is wonderfully provisional, a working draft always open to revision. A new scanning technology that can see deeper into sediments, a storm that scours away sand to reveal a forgotten wall, a reinterpretation of a faded inscription. Any of these can overturn a decades-old assumption. The narrative of how ancient civilizations, their geography, is not a closed book. It is a living manuscript, and we are still turning the pages, discovering with each new line that the ancient engineers were often even more clever, more adaptable, and more mysterious than we had ever supposed. Their silent stones now speak a final, unifying truth. These artificial harbors are not merely ruins of commerce or conquest. They are the enduring monuments of a species that refuses to accept the map it is given. In every block set against the tide, in every canal cut through desert sand, we see the same profound dialogue unfolding, a conversation between human aspiration and earthly limitation. The sea offered chaos and danger, a formless frontier of salt and storm. Human society craved order, connection, and exchange. The harbor was the grammar invented to translate between these two worlds, a constructed syntax of calm and access. They were first and foremost tools of breathtaking ambition. Pharaohs, emperors, and merchant kings used them to project power across watery distances, to feed metropolises, and to secure wealth from the edges of the known world. The breakwater was a political argument made in rock, declaring that a ruler's will could literally reshape the frontier. Yet they were also engines of profound adaptation. The solutions were never universal. The concrete monoliths of Rome would have sunk into the soft silt of the Indus Delta, just as brick locks would have been pulverized by Mediterranean winter storms. Each civilization listened to its own coastline, to the whisper of its tides, the mood of its winds, the stubbornness of its seabed, and devised a unique answer. This adaptability is their deepest genius. They prove that innovation is not a single invention, but a language of problem-solving spoken in countless dialects, from the volcanic ash of Italy to the kiln-fired brick of India. To walk their sunken foundations is to trace a history written in risk and resilience. Every project was a colossal gamble of resources and lives. A design flaw could mean financial ruin or starvation if the grain ships could not dock. A storm during construction could wipe out years of labor. They required a vision that stretched beyond a single lifetime, a faith that the original engineers would still be dredging the basin and repairing the quays. This long-term commitment speaks to a powerful collective will, an agreement across generations that the gateway was worth the perpetual cost. And within that gateway, a quieter, more enduring transformation took place. These ports became the world's first global villages. In the crowded streets of Ostia or the warehouses of Alexandria, a sailor from Arabia could bargain with a merchant from Gaul, their goods translating their languages. New gods found homes beside old ones, foods were exchanged along with currencies, and ideas sailed in with every ship. The harbor, built to defy physical geography, became a powerful force for dissolving human geography, the imagined barriers of culture and origin. It created neutral ground where connection was the only currency that mattered. So what do these places ultimately teach us? They reveal that the greatest obstacles to human progress have often been the most elemental, not ideologies or borders, but the raw, physical challenges of our planet. A treacherous coast, a relentless desert, a river that refused to reach the sea. The story of these harbors is the story of looking at such a barrier and deciding not to go around it, but to reimagine it entirely. It is a testament to the belief that our environment is not a fixed stage, but a partner in a constant negotiation, a dialogue where creativity can answer limitation with a new design. They geography to transform trade, and in doing so, they quietly laid the foundations for the interconnected world we inhabit today. The next time you see a massive container ship glide into a modern port, remember, you are witnessing the latest chapter in a very old story. It is a story that began when someone first looked at an empty, windswept shore and saw not an end, but a beginning waiting to be built. From those Phoenician moles to Roman concrete colossi, from the tidal dock of to the monsoon port of, we have traced an epic of stone and will. This was not merely a history of engineering, but the story of infrastructure that built the world. These artificial harbors were the pivotal nodes, the essential hardware, for the first great era of globalization. They wove separate continents into a single, whispering network of exchange, where Egyptian grain fed Roman families, Indian pepper seasoned meals in Pompeii, and ideas sailed alongside silk and spices. They turned the chaotic, trackless sea into a mapped and managed highway, proving that human connection could be engineered into existence. This legacy asks us to reconsider what true innovation looks like. It is not always a new gadget or a digital code. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to look at a windswept, empty shore and see a possibility invisible to everyone else. It is the courage to invest a generation's labor into a foundation you will benefit from, to commit to a perpetual conversation with the sea, knowing the dredging will never truly end. These places remind us that progress is often a story of creative constraint, of listening to a specific problem, the silt of a river, the fury of a monsoon, the whisper of a tide, and crafting a brilliant, localized answer. So the next time you see the orderly stacks of a modern container port or trace a shipping lane on a digital map, pause for a moment. Remember the ancient innovators who first dared to build where geography said they could not. Their silent, submerged stones are the first chapters of our connected world, a testament to the enduring human impulse to reach beyond the horizon, not by chance, but by design. If you found this journey into the foundations of trade compelling, please subscribe for more explorations into the forgotten corners of our past. We would love to hear which of these harbor marvels captured your imagination most. Was it the locked basin of, the hidden naval ring of Carthage, or the concrete machine of? Share your thoughts in the comments below.